So thank you to John and to Brenda for the opportunity to come here and speak with you. And I appreciated the opportunity to sit in the audience because while I've had the benefit of seeing Mark's presentation, I've not seen Jeff and Nick present. So my job is to round out the panel and spend a little bit of time talking about driver behavior. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study that we did looking at this issue and cover the usual highlights in terms of the study that we conducted. For those of you who are not familiar with our organization, we are an independent road safety research institute based here in Ottawa. So Nick had talked about the evolution and when these will hit the streets. And I think to your point, it's changing daily when we will see these new vehicles on the road and at what level of automation. So it's very difficult to present. My job is to highlight some key findings from the world of driver behavior and provide some insight to you in terms of how that will shape our experiences with automated vehicles as they do become available. In Canada, we conducted a rather large sample of more than 2,600 respondents. We used a large sample because we wanted to make regional comparisons with the data as well. So we had respondents with a valid license who'd driven in the last 30 days, and we've broken them down to make sure that it was representative. We also did 4 focus groups here in Ontario because this is where they will pilot test vehicles, and we had also representativeness in our focus groups, including older drivers as well as non-drivers. So at the beginning of the survey, we did ask a few questions up front about their familiarity with vehicles and automation to get some baseline before we went ahead and defined those terms and asked them more questions. The focus was really to look at 3 different behavioral aspects. One was the ease of use and the perceived usefulness. Another was trust in automation, and then finally the behavioral adaptation portion. So we can see that many drivers say that they are familiar with automated vehicles and self-driving technology. We see that almost 70% enjoy their time on the road, although I will agree the commute not so much, although the upside of the commute is nobody can reach you when you're in your car commuting, so that's a benefit. Those who drove longer distances and were male were more likely to enjoy driving. We saw that very small percentages thought that they would be relaxing to use, and again, generally younger, generally male who thought this. Conversely, more respondents said that it would be stressful, and we see among these older drivers as well. We asked, would you use one of these vehicles today? And you can see that many drivers are undecided or would not use the vehicle today, and largely around the issue of safety and the uncertainty of safety associated with these vehicles. One of the interesting things we asked was who should be protected in a collision. We see a lot of discussion about ethical algorithms, and we still see there is a large expectation that the vehicle will protect the driver and the occupants of the vehicle, although regionally we did see some variations in those results. You can see that drivers are not expecting much of a learning curve. They think that the vehicles would be easy to use. They think that the current knowledge they have would be appropriate to use one of these vehicles. So very much like you go to the dealership, pick up your vehicle, do a pilot test, drive it off the lot, and it's yours, they're expecting a very similar process. And actually, when it came to fully self-driving vehicles, drivers actually thought they would need to know less than they know today. When we asked if they were usefulness, we're not expecting a lot in terms of usefulness, largely because drivers still feel that they will drive better than the technology. So they don't think the technology will make them a better or a safer driver. They don't necessarily think it will reduce their travel time because of increased congestion with more vehicles on the road. And some would use it to commute if they could return home, but more were inclined to say that they wouldn't do that, concerned about the environmental impacts. I mention commuting because we have a very small population that currently uses public transportation to commute, and we see that among those who use public transportation, at least a portion of them would be more inclined to use a self-driving vehicle. So we may see declines in public transportation as a result. In terms of usefulness, this is from the focus group, some of the reasons why, and you see the standard things up there. What was interesting was that in the focus groups of non-drivers, they were not sure that this would increase their mobility because many of them do need someone to help them in and out of the vehicle. So unless the self-driving vehicle was coming with a person to assist them, they weren't sure that they would be useful. Most notably in terms of the concerns, there was a concern about reduction in family interaction and family time because you spend time in the vehicle with your kids, taking them to school, taking them to soccer practice, taking road trips, and there was concern about that. In terms of safety, we saw, again, low percentages said they would feel safe using a vehicle, and this really corresponds with the 23% and 17% who said they would use one of these vehicles today. We saw that trust decreased as driver aged, and we see things in terms of the notice to take over driving. We had them say everything from a few seconds to several minutes to a few hours to a full day. Like, I would like to get in my car and have it tell me first thing in the morning, by the way, you may have to take control today, so pay attention. Not necessarily going to happen. And only a third of drivers thought that the warning systems would provide enough notice. We also had drivers tell us that the vehicle shouldn't hand back control, it should pull over and stop itself. If it was going to hand back control, it should tell you what you should be doing when it hands back control. So very interesting expectations around that feature. We asked drivers if the vehicles would perform better than themselves on regular roadways, as well as in response to hazards like vulnerable road users and poor driving conditions. And again, more drivers thought that they would respond better than the technology in those situations. We did see that at least 16% of the respondents didn't think they would have to pay attention at all in a limited self-driving vehicle. So we do see that drivers are very much ready to disengage in the driving task if they are not already. And again, drivers were less likely to do this as age increased and males. Activities that drivers said that they would do. So 77% said they would remain vigilant, and it was very clear from the focus groups. They will remain vigilant at the outset until they feel confident in the technology the first few tries, and then they don't want to pay attention. So we saw significant increases in driving tired, driving distracted, flat out sleeping, speeding, and drinking and driving. And here's the comparison in terms of what drivers currently say they do in their car versus what they say they're planning to do in their car. So certainly when it comes to fatigue and distraction, we see more drivers who are willing to engage in those behaviors when they're driving. We asked, worst case scenario, would you turn the technology off to speed or to run a red light? And we see at least a third of them will turn it off to speed, and 13 to 14% will turn it off to run a red light, not only in good conditions, but in bad conditions. And I hate to call out Quebec, but Quebec was very inclined to turn them off in both instances. In Ontario, you're much more law-abiding when it comes to speed. You are willing to live with it for speed, but you also would turn it off for running a red light. So we did see variations across the country. Just some anecdotes from the focus groups to give you a flavor of some of the things that driver had said. Might need a lesson or two, but we'll figure it out. I wouldn't use one unless there's an override feature, and if the vehicle didn't drive the way I thought it would, they would turn it off. So to Mark's point, yeah, they're looking to be able to turn it off. So in terms of key findings, we see basically there's a significant disconnect between drivers' expectations and knowledge about SDVs and where the technology is actually at and how vehicle manufacturers and regulators are thinking about it. We see that drivers are going to want to do the same and perhaps do more of it, which is a concern. So the good news is we still have a little bit of time, according to Nick, to figure out a good way to make sure that the public's expectations and knowledge is more aligned with what the technology can actually do. The bad news is, in terms of early adopters, we see males and younger drivers will most likely adopt these sooner rather than later, which is our crash population oftentimes. So we need to do a much better job of fixing that disconnect and closing that gap between expectations and reality to ensure that our early adopters are prepared to drive. And of concern, we see older drivers who are most likely to benefit from the improvements in mobility, and the features offered by the vehicle are the least likely ones to want to use them at this stage of the game. So we need to do a lot more to build confidence among older drivers. So a lot of misconceptions in terms of the role of the driver currently. The limitations of the technology are very much underestimated. And again, if we make it possible for drivers to ultimately turn these technologies off, as we do with some other safety technologies, we may not see the benefits that we are looking for. So with that, I want to leave you with 3 numbers. If you remember nothing of the other numbers that I shared with you, remember these 3. 4 is the number of weeks it takes Google to train a Google driver, which is not to say that we're all going to need 4 weeks to learn how to drive a car again, but it does show you how fundamentally different the interaction between the driver and the vehicle is, and we will have to pay attention to that. 7.2 is the percentage of increase in crashes, total crashes in the US in 2015. They lost a whole decade of gains in a year, and preliminary estimates for 2016 show another increase. So if you think that the role of driver behavior is not important, this happened at a time when vehicles and roads have never been safer. So we definitely need to pay attention. 68%, again, is the proportion who said they would not use one of these vehicles today. So what I want to leave you with is we have done a great job making safer vehicles, making safer roads, and telling drivers that they're safer. And we still have a crash problem. So if we continue to replicate that process, our expectation that drivers will spontaneously act more safely on the road while we go through this transition period, we may be a little bit misguided in thinking that our drivers will come along as we make moves to improve safety. That's it. I would like to thank Maricela, who's here from our office, who did a lot of the analyses and did the regional analyses. So thank you for that, Maricela, and my colleague Ward. And the infographic is the abridged version of the report for an easy read. Thank you.